Her son called it a breakdown. Her daughter flew home from Denver to talk her out of it. She sat with both of them at the kitchen table and listened to everything they said. The concern, the practicality, the careful language people use when they believe they are managing someone who has stopped being able to manage themselves. She listened without interrupting. She did not argue. Then she drove to the bank and placed a cashier's check for $47,000 on a real estate agent's desk. The property, 14 Sycamore Lane, 19 years vacant, overgrown front walk, one shutter hanging at an angle, a roof that needed work, and a reputation in the neighborhood as the house that should have been torn down a decade ago. Harriet was 72 years old. That check was everything she had. She was not having a breakdown. She was the only person on Sycamore Lane who knew why the Calloway house had been empty for 19 years, and she had been waiting with the patience of someone who understood that the right moment is worth every moment before it, for the one condition that needed to be true before she could act. 3 weeks ago, that condition became true. She had been ready for 3 weeks. She had been ready in a certain sense for 19 years. The house was hers now. She walked to the front door with a key in her hand and unlocked it the way you unlock something you have been waiting to open for a very long time, without hurry, without drama, with the complete and quiet confidence of a woman who has always known what was on the other side. Inside in the basement, there was a wooden cabinet beside an old fireplace that nobody had opened in 19 years. Harriet had a key for that, too. Vincent Calloway had given it to her himself on an afternoon in 2004, sitting on his front porch, when he had told her the one thing he had never told anyone else. She moved through the dark with a flashlight down the basement stairs across the concrete floor to the far wall where the old fireplace sat cold, and the cabinet stood beside it, locked exactly where Vincent had said it would be. She tried the handle, locked. She reached into her coat pocket. The key was small brass, the kind cut for furniture rather than doors. She had carried it for 19 years in the bottom of the same coat pocket, moving it from coat to coat each winter, the way you move the things you cannot afford to lose. She held it up to the flashlight beam. She said quietly, "Vincent said to use this if I ever needed to." She inserted the key. The lock turned. She opened the cabinet. The flashlight fell on a stack of documents bound, ordered exactly as Vincent had left them. She picked up the top one. She read the title. She read it again. She exhaled slow, complete 19 years long. Harriet read the legal notices section of the county recorder's website every morning at 7:15, the way other people read the news. 31 years as a surveying technician had given her the habit, and retirement had not taken it away. It had simply removed the professional obligation and left the practice, which she had come to understand, was not the same thing as the obligation, and was in fact more important. On the Tuesday morning in February 2024, she read what she had been waiting 19 years to read. Mercer Group versus Estate of Vincent Calloway, appeal dismissed. Judgment final. Property released for probate administration. She read it twice. She set down her coffee. She looked at the annotated map on the corkboard beside the kitchen window, a street map of the Sycamore Lane area, marked in her own hand over many years, with notations she had never explained to anyone who had ever stood in her kitchen. The map had been there since 2006. Nobody had asked about it. She picked up her phone. Raymond Cho, attorney. She had saved the number 12 years ago after finding his name in the public record as the administrator of Vincent Calloway's estate. She had called it once before 7 years earlier to ask about the status of the Mercer litigation. His assistant had said he was unavailable. He had not called back. She had noted the non-return call in the margin of her map with the date and continued reading the county recorder site every morning. This time Raymond answered. She identified herself. She told him she was calling about 14 Sycamore Lane, that the Mercer appeal had been dismissed that morning and the property was being released for probate administration. She said it the way she said most things, directly, with the specific detail that was relevant and nothing extra. Raymond was quiet for a moment. "You've been monitoring the case." "Since 2005, Harriet said. Another silence, longer with more in it. "Mrs. Voss." His voice had shifted into the careful register of a man who has been holding something for a long time and is choosing his next words precisely. "Are you the neighbor? The one Vincent mentioned?" Harriet said yes. Raymond did not tell her the contents of the will on the phone. He told her the property would be listed within 60 days through standard probate proceedings and that she should contact him once it was formally available. He said this carefully, specifically, the way you say something to a person you want to make sure understands the full meaning of what you are saying without your having to state it directly. Harriet noted the tone. She understood what it meant. 3 days later, she called a real estate attorney, a woman named Patricia Osee, who had been recommended by a colleague from her surveying years and who asked the right questions in the right order. Harriet explained the property, the history, the 19-year vacancy, the Mercer litigation, and its resolution. She explained her intention to purchase. Patricia said, "The listing price will depend on probate appraisal. Do you have the financial resources?" Harriet opened the folder on her kitchen table. She had prepared it the morning after reading the court notice, her retirement account statement current balance printed and placed in a manila folder with the court notice clipped to the front. She looked at the number. "I have enough," she said, "if the appraisal reflects 19 years of abandonment and a disputed title history." It did. She called Gerald that evening. She told him simply, without the detail that would have required her to explain things she was not yet ready to explain, that she intended to purchase 14 Sycamore Lane. Gerald asked 3 questions in the order a reasonable person would ask them. How much? $47,000? Was that her entire pension? Yes. Had she had a property inspection? Not yet. He was quiet for 10 seconds. "Mom, that is every dollar you have." "I know, Gerald. That's why I'm telling you rather than surprising you." "That's not reassuring." "It wasn't meant to be reassuring. It was meant to be accurate." He asked her to wait 2 weeks. She said she would think about it. Susan flew in from Denver 4 days later, and they sat at the kitchen table. And Susan was thorough and loving and genuinely frightened, and Harriet listened to all of it with the complete attention she gave everything. She did not argue. She did not explain. When Susan finished, Harriet said, "I appreciate you coming." She signed the purchase agreement on a Thursday morning 11 days after reading the court notice. The real estate agent was a young man who did not know the history of the property and was straightforwardly grateful for a clean cash offer in a probate situation. He handed her the keys at the closing table with the routine cheerfulness of someone completing a transaction. She thanked him. She drove to Sycamore Lane. She parked in front of the house. She sat for a moment and looked at it. 19 years of abandonment, the overgrown walk, the hanging shutter, the particular stillness of a structure that has been waiting without knowing it was waiting. She said quietly to nobody, "I'm here, Vincent." She had been reading the county recorder's site every morning for 19 years. She had the attorney's number saved for 12. She had the folder ready, the finances calculated, the decision already made before the legal system caught up. Her children thought she had acted impulsively. She had been preparing since 2005. The only impulsive thing about it was how fast she moved once the window opened. If stories like this matter to you, stories about quiet people who were dismissed but never truly defeated, this channel was made for you. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Susan landed at the regional airport on Saturday morning with a rolling carry-on, a return ticket for Monday, and a 12-slide presentation she had built on the flight, using property records she had pulled from her laptop the night Gerald called. She had called Gerald twice during the layover. They had agreed on the approach, calm, rational, specific. They had agreed Susan would do most of the talking. They had not asked Harriet if she was available Saturday. Harriet opened the door in old jeans, a flannel shirt, and the surveying boots she had owned for 22 years, the ones with the reinforced toe that she had resoled twice rather than replace. She was clearly on her way somewhere. She looked at Susan's carry-on, then at Susan. "I know," she said before Susan spoke. "Come in. I'll make coffee. I have about 40 minutes before I need to get to the house." Susan sat at the kitchen table while Harriet made coffee and looked at the kitchen the way she looked at properties, noting conditions, assessing, trying to understand what she was working with. the corkboard on the wall, the map with the annotations she didn't recognize, the folder on the counter that had been there she suspected for longer than this week. She opened her phone. She began. The presentation was thorough. She had pulled comparable sales on Sycamore Lane Limited given the age and character of the street, but sufficient to establish a baseline. Abandoned property rehabilitation costs in the county sourced from 2 contractor review sites and a county housing report from 2022. The specific risk profile of purchasing a property whose title had been under active legal dispute for 19 years and had only been cleared 72 hours before Harriet signed a purchase agreement. She walked through each slide with the precision of a woman who managed commercial real estate in Denver and understood that precision was a form of love when the stakes were this high. Harriet listened to all of it. She did not interrupt once. When Susan finished, she looked up from her phone. Harriet said, "That's a good analysis, Susan. So you understand why we're concerned." "I understand completely why you're concerned. You're working with the information you have." Susan set the phone down. "Then help me understand what information I'm missing." Harriet looked at her daughter, at the careful face, the carry-on by the door, the return ticket for Monday. She considered the question with the same deliberateness she brought to everything that mattered. "Not yet," she said. "I need to go to the house first." She stood and took her coffee to the counter. "Come with me if you want." Susan went. She stood in the overgrown front garden of 14 Sycamore Lane and looked at it the way she had been looking at it since the car. The peeling paint, the cracked porch steps, the front walk consumed by 19 years of growth, the hanging shutter that moved slightly in the February wind. She was a woman who assessed properties for a living, and she was assessing this one, and the assessment was not good. "Mom," she said quietly, "what are we doing here?" Harriet was already on the porch, unlocking the front door. Inside, she moved through the rooms with an ease that stopped Susan in the front hallway. Not the careful hesitation of someone entering an unfamiliar space, the calm, attentive movement of a surveyor, walking a site she knows, running her hand along the plaster wall beside the staircase, checking the give of the floor joists near the kitchen threshold, going to the window at the back of the upstairs bedroom, and looking at the roofline from the inside with the specific angle of someone who knows what she is checking for. Susan followed. Her concern was shifting into something she did not yet have a name for. "You've been here before," she said. Harriet was checking the condition of the window frame. "Many times. Vincent and I had tea on that porch for 30 years. "Vincent Calloway?" "Yes." She moved toward the door. "He was my neighbor for a long time. He was a particular person. He trusted very few people with things that mattered to him." She looked at the room one more time. "Come downstairs." The basement door was off the kitchen. Harriet opened it and descended without hesitation, the way you descend stairs you have not used in 19 years but have walked in your mind enough times that the distance is familiar. Susan stopped at the top. The basement was cold, dim concrete floor and old stone foundation. In the far corner beside the old fireplace that had not been lit in 2 decades, there was a wooden cabinet oak, standing approximately 4 feet high with a simple latch and a keyhole below it. It was locked. It had not been disturbed. It sat exactly where it had always sat in the particular stillness of an object that has been waiting. Harriet stood before it. She did not touch it. Susan from the top of the stairs. "Mom, what's down there?" Harriet looked at the cabinet for a long moment. "The reason," she said. She came back up the stairs. She locked the basement door. She put the key in her coat pocket, the small brass one, not the house key, the one she had been carrying for 19 years, and she moved toward the front of the house. In the car, Susan was quiet for several minutes. Then, "You're not going to tell me, are you?" "Not yet." "Oh, why not?" Harriet looked at the road. "Because I've been certain about this for 19 years without telling anyone. I can wait 1 more week to be certain in a different way." She paused. "I want to open the cabinet before I explain what I believe is in it. I've been patient for 19 years, Susan. 1 more week is not patience, it's just timing." Susan looked at her mother, the profile of a woman in surveying boots who had spent $47,000 in 11 days and was not confused or frightened or grieving, who moved through an abandoned house like she owned it, which she did, and had perhaps always understood that she would. Susan looked at the annotated map she had photographed with her phone before they left the house. She looked at it for a long time. For the first time since landing, she thought she might be wrong about what was happening here. Susan flew back to Denver on Monday without the conversation she had come to have. She had brought a 12-slide presentation and left with a question she couldn't answer. If her mother wasn't reckless, wasn't confused, wasn't making a grief-driven mistake, then what exactly did she know? The answer was in a locked cabinet in the basement of an abandoned house on Sycamore Lane. Harriet would open it when she was ready. 1 week after the closing on a Wednesday morning in February, Harriet returned to 14 Sycamore Lane alone. Susan was back in Denver. Gerald had stopped calling daily. The calls had tapered from 3 a day to 1, to a cautious silence that meant he had decided to wait, rather than continue a conversation he was not winning. The family intervention had subsided into the particular quiet of people who have made their case and been heard and declined. Harriet drove to Sycamore Lane, parked in front, walked through the front door, and went directly to the basement. She stood before the wooden cabinet beside the old fireplace and produced the brass key from her coat pocket. Before she inserted it, she let herself remember the afternoon Vincent had pressed it into her hand. It had been November of 2004. He was in his final months, not dying yet, not in any way that was visible, but moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who had begun to put things in order. He had walked her down to the basement after tea, which was unusual. Vincent's hospitality lived on the porch and in the kitchen, not in the basement. He had walked her to the cabinet and held the key out to her without preamble. She had looked at it, then at him. He had said, "You're the only person I know who would understand what's in here, Harriet." His voice had been the voice of a man who had considered this for a long time and arrived at a conclusion he trusted. "You spent 30 years reading ground surveys. You know what it means when something is suppressed rather than simply not found." She had asked, "What is it?" He had said, "The reason why this land is worth more than any developer will admit, and worth more than money to someone who understands it." He had closed her hand around the key. "If I'm not here and the litigation ever ends, come back. Open it. You'll know what to do." She had carried the key for 20 years. She inserted it now. The lock turned with the smooth resistance of a mechanism that had been well made and had not been used, and the cabinet door opened. It was dry inside. Vincent had sealed the edges. She could see the bead of old weatherproofing compound along the frame, the particular forethought of an engineer who understood that documents are only as useful as their preservation. The contents were undisturbed, arranged in manila folders, labeled in Vincent's precise engineer's hand, the careful block lettering of someone trained to write in the field legible under any conditions. Top folder, Sycamore Lane Geological Survey, 1987, Preliminary and Final Reports. Second folder, Mercer Group Correspondence 1999 to 2004. Third folder, Aquifer Identification Confidential Assessment V, Callaway Private Commission 2001. Harriet took the top folder and opened it. She read with the focused efficiency of a former surveying technician the notation system, the coordinate grid, the soil classification codes, the terminology of subsurface assessment. These were not mysteries to her. They were a professional language she had spoken for 31 years and had never unlearned. She read the preliminary report, then the final. She read the appendices. She read the surveyor's certification. What she was reading, a 1987 County Commission geological survey that had identified a significant subsurface aquifer running beneath a portion of Sycamore Lane, beneath specifically the cluster of lots that Mercer Group had spent the first years of the new century attempting to acquire. The survey findings had never been entered into the public record. There was a note in the margin of the final report, not in Vincent's hand, older, a different ink, and she recognized it as the notation style of a county surveyor's office from that era. The note referenced a file number. The file she knew from her own career in that office had been closed without public entry. The county surveyor at the time had taken payments from Mercer Group. That finding had come out in a separate investigation years later. The survey had been suppressed before anyone outside the office had seen it. Vincent had seen it. He had kept his copy. She set the geological survey folder on the floor beside her and opened the Mercer correspondence. 5 years of letters in chronological order, paperclip by year. She read them in sequence. The early ones were offers reasonable, increasing, persistent. Then the tone changed in 2002 into the register of a company that had decided persuasion was no longer the most efficient approach. Legal language appeared. Boundary disputes were suggested, then asserted, then filed. Vincent had annotated every letter in red ink precise marginal notes in his engineer's hand, dating each claim, cross-referencing it against survey coordinates, noting the specific legal mechanism being employed and its accuracy relative to the actual property record. The annotations were devastating in the way that precision is always devastating when applied to dishonesty. Every fabricated claim was labeled as fabricated, and the fabrication documented. Reading them was like watching a very careful man build a complete record of what was being done to him for no audience he expected to find, simply because accuracy was what he owed the truth. She opened the aquifer assessment last. Vincent had commissioned it privately in 2001 through a hydrogeological firm in the next county, far enough from the local network that Mercer's reach would not have extended to it. The report confirmed the 1987 findings and added 15 years of additional data. The aquifer had grown and identified significance. Its flow rate and mineral content updated with new modeling. Estimated commercial value of mineral extraction rights, $800,000 to $1.4 million as of 2001. Harriet sat down on the basement floor. She had not sat on a concrete floor since her last field job years before retirement. She spread the documents around her in the order she had read them, and sat with them and read them again fully from the beginning, the way you read something when you want to be certain that what you understood the first time is what is actually there. It was. She stacked everything back in the cabinet in the exact order she had found it. She closed the cabinet. She did not lock it. There was no longer any reason to lock it. She took out her phone and called Raymond Cho. He answered on the second ring quickly, as if the call had not surprised him. "Raymond," Harriet said. "I've opened the cabinet." A silence. "What did you find?" She told him the geological survey, the suppressed county record, the Mercer correspondence with Vincent's annotations, the private aquifer assessment. She told it in sequence, precisely the way she had written field reports for 31 years. When she finished, there was a silence long enough to mean something. Raymond said, "Mrs. Voss, there is a condition in Vincent's will that I have never been able to fulfill in 19 years. I've been waiting for someone to come forward who could meet it. I believe you may be the person it was written for." Harriet said, "The first person who comes and understands why I didn't sell." A very long silence. "He told you." "In 2004, on his porch, over tea," Raymond said after a moment. "Mrs. Voss, I think you should come to my office." She had been a surveying technician for 29 years. She had read thousands of geological documents. She had known from the moment Vincent handed her the key that whatever was in that cabinet was technical, specific, and significant. She had not known it was worth $1.2 million. She had not needed to know. She had only needed to understand why Vincent hadn't sold. And sitting on the floor of that basement with the documents spread around her, she understood completely. Vincent had not been protecting land. He had been protecting water. Raymond Cho's office was on the second floor of a building on the county seat's main street that had housed 3 different law practices over 60 years and currently housed 1. It was a small, well-maintained space, the office of a man who had practiced in one place for a long time and had arranged his surroundings to reflect that permanence. Shelves of organized files, a window that looked onto the street, a conference table that had been there longer than Raymond had. When Harriet arrived on Friday morning, Raymond was already seated at the table. The will was open in front of him. Beside it, a file she had not seen thick tabbed the complete estate documentation of Vincent Calloway. He stood when she came in. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been expecting a particular meeting for a very long time and has until this moment been uncertain it would ever occur. He gestured to the chair across from him. Before she sat, he said, "Mrs. Voss, I want to tell you something before we discuss the legal specifics." She sat. She waited. In 19 years, 6 people came to me with some claim to this estate. 2 were distant relatives of Vincent's who had never met him and whose connection to the family could not be verified beyond a genealogical database. 1 was a representative of Mercer Group claiming the property as satisfaction of a legal judgment that the court subsequently rejected in its entirety. 2 were real estate investors who had researched the property through public records and presented valuations based on the abandoned condition alone. He paused. 1 was a neighbor from 3 houses down who believed Vincent had promised him the property in a casual conversation in 1998. He looked at her. "None of them could tell me why Vincent hadn't sold?" Raymond opened the will to a marked page and read the relevant clause aloud, the formal language of a document written by a man who had worked in engineering, long enough to understand that precision is the only protection against misinterpretation. He read, "I leave the entirety of my estate, including the property at 14 Sycamore Lane, and all contents therein, to the first person who presents themselves to my attorney after the resolution of all pending litigation, and demonstrates to my attorney's reasonable satisfaction a genuine understanding of the reason I declined to sell my property to Mercer Group or any affiliated party. This understanding must be based on knowledge obtained from me directly, not from public record." The last sentence remained in the room after Raymond stopped reading. Harriet said, "Knowledge obtained from me directly." "Yes." Raymond closed the will carefully. That was the barrier that 19 years and 6 claimants could not cross. The Mercer litigation was eventually a matter of public record. Anyone with research skills and time could reconstruct the legal history. But the geological survey was never in the public record. The county suppressed it in 1987 before it was filed, and the surveyor responsible was later found to have accepted payments from Mercer-affiliated parties. The only people who knew about the aquifer from Vincent's own knowledge were Vincent and whoever he chose to tell. He looked at her directly. "He told you." "In the fall of 2004, Harriet said. "A Thursday afternoon. He brought me down to the basement and showed me the cabinet. He had the aquifer report with him. He had taken it out of the cabinet to show me the map. I remember the coordinate notation. I recognized it immediately from my work." She paused. "He put it back and locked the cabinet and gave me the key and said if he wasn't here when the litigation ended, I should come back and open it." Raymond nodded slowly. He opened the second file. "Mrs. Voss, you purchased the property through the probate listing for $47,000. The appraisal reflected the abandoned condition, the deferred maintenance, and the 19-year disputed title history, which is standard probate methodology for a property of this character." He removed a document from the file and slid it across the table. "I commissioned an updated geological assessment 14 months ago in anticipation of the Mercer litigation finally reaching conclusion. I wanted to be prepared." Harriet picked up the assessment. She turned to the technical section first, the maps, the coordinate data, the flow rate analysis. Her eyes moved across the page with professional speed. She stopped at the coordinate notation. "Same aquifer," she said. "The same aquifer. The water table has risen over the intervening decades. The commercial viability assessment has, if anything, improved." Raymond indicated a figure on the summary page. "Current assessed value for water rights and mineral extraction development, $1.1 to $1.4 million. Harriet set the document down. She looked at the figure for a moment, not with the expression of someone receiving unexpected news, but with the expression of someone seeing a number confirm what they had never quite allowed themselves to calculate directly. She had known the aquifer was significant. She had not permitted herself to think in specific figures. The figures were now in front of her on Raymond's conference table on a Friday morning in February. She said, "All right." Raymond proceeded. He documented her account of the 2004 conversation with Vincent formally. Her recollection of the specific content of what he had told her, her possession of the brass key, which she produced and placed on the table, her account of opening the cabinet and reading the documents 3 days earlier. He took her statement typed and printed it, and she reviewed and signed it. He notarized it. He signed the estate transfer document. The property and all its contents were legally yours from the moment you satisfied the condition, Mrs. Voss. The transfer simply makes that official in the record. Harriet looked at the signed documents on the table between them. She said, "Raymond, why didn't you try harder to find the right person? 19 years is a long time to hold an estate open." Raymond considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Vincent was specific knowledge obtained directly not from research. I could not advertise for that without invalidating the condition. A public search for someone Vincent had personally informed about a suppressed geological survey would have been legally an invitation to fabrication. He paused. All I could do was wait for the person to come to me. A longer pause. He was very certain you would come. He said so, not in the will separately. He reached into the file and removed a small folded piece of paper. It was old. The fold had set into the paper over 19 years. He slid it across the table without comment. Harriet looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up and unfolded it. Vincent's handwriting, the same engineer's block script from the folder labels in the cabinet, precise and unhurried. 4 lines. "Harriet, I knew it would be you. You were the only neighbor who ever asked the right questions. The land will be in better hands than I could have arranged. Don't let them pave over the water. VC." She read it twice. She folded it along its original crease and placed it in her coat pocket, the same pocket that had carried the brass key for 20 years. She looked at Raymond. "He was a good man." Raymond said, "Yes." A pause. "He was also correct about you." She had spent $47,000. The property with the aquifer rights assessed was worth between $1.1 and $1.4 million. She had not purchased the house as a financial investment. She had purchased it because Vincent had asked her in the way of someone who doesn't ask directly to be the person who came. She was the only person on Sycamore Lane he had trusted with the truth. She had honored that trust for 19 years. The numbers were simply the universe confirming what she had already known. "Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Has someone ever dismissed you or someone you loved and later realized how wrong they were? Tell me in the comments." I read every single one. Gerald arrived at 10 on Saturday morning with the particular caution of a man who has been wrong about something significant and has been given enough time to know it, but not enough information to understand how wrong. Harriet was at the kitchen table. The corkboard map was down from the wall and spread flat on the surface in front of her, alongside a set of documents she had organized that morning in the sequence she intended to present them. Gerald looked at the table. He sat down across from her without speaking. Harriet did not begin with the numbers. She began with Vincent. She told it in order the way a surveyor presents a finding, because she had learned in 31 years that context presented before data produces understanding, while data presented before context produces only reaction. She told Gerald about the 30 years of tea on the porch, about the kind of man Vincent was, an engineer who had worked in water resource management for the county in the 1970s, who understood subsurface geology the way other men understood weather, who had looked at the land under Sycamore Lane and seen something nobody else had thought to look for. About the afternoon in November 2004, when Vincent had walked her down to the basement and shown her the cabinet and pressed the key into her hand and told her what was in it. About 19 years of reading the county recorder's website at 7:15 every morning. About the annotated map on the corkboard. Gerald looked at the map. He looked at the annotations, dates, case numbers, notations in his mother's hand, tracking the progress of litigation he had never known she was monitoring. He did not say anything. As she spoke, Harriet placed each document on the table in order. The 1987 Geological Survey preliminary and final reports, the coordinate maps, the suppressed county certification, the Mercer Group correspondence, 5 years of letters with Vincent's red ink annotations in the margins, the private aquifer assessment from 2001, the relevant clause from Vincent's will, Raymond's estate transfer document signed and notarized dated 3 days ago. Gerald was an accountant. He followed sequences. He understood paper trails. He watched his mother build one across the kitchen table, and he read each document as she placed it in the order. She placed it without interrupting. He picked up the 1987 Geological Survey and looked at it. He looked at the coordinate notations. He did not read them with her professional fluency, but he recognized their structure, the precise language of a technical instrument. He picked up the updated assessment Raymond had commissioned and laid it beside the 1987 survey. He compared the maps. He was quiet for a long time. "It's the same formation," he said. "Yes. The county suppressed this." He was not asking. He was confirming what he had just read in Vincent's annotations. In 1987, the surveyor at the time had a relationship with Mercer-affiliated parties that was investigated and confirmed years later. The survey was closed before it was filed publicly. Vincent had received a copy. Before the closure, he had been involved in the preliminary assessment as a private consultant. He kept his copy and then commissioned his own. In 2001, to update the data and establish independent verification. She tapped the private assessment. He had both. Gerald set the 1987 survey down. He picked up the updated geological assessment Raymond's commission, 14 months old, and turned to the summary page. He found the figure. He read it. He set the document down with the careful placement of a man who needs a moment before he speaks. "Mom," he looked at her. "The updated assessment, 1.1 to 1.4 million. "Yes." "You spent $47,000. "Yes." He was quiet. Then, "You knew." Harriet said, "I believed." There is a difference. I believed for 19 years, and I could not prove it until I opened the cabinet and read what was there. Belief is not the same as knowledge. I have spent my career in the difference between those two things." She looked at him steadily. "I believed correctly, but I did not know until Wednesday." Gerald looked at the table, at the documents laid out in their sequence, at the map with 19 years of notations, at the estate transfer with his mother's signature at the bottom. "When I called you, when I said it was a breakdown," he stopped. "I know." "When Susan flew out with the presentation," "I know, Gerald." "I was completely wrong." Harriet said, "You were working with the information you had. That is exactly what I told Susan when she sat at this table. You had accurate information about the property's visible condition, its market history, and my financial situation. Your analysis of those three factors was correct." A pause. "I withheld the fourth factor. I did that deliberately." Gerald looked at her. "Why?" "Because if I had told you what I believed before, I had the documents in hand, and the will condition confirmed, you would have had more reasons to stop me, and they would have looked like reasonable reasons, because they would have been reasonable reasons applied to incomplete information." She folded her hands on the table. "I have watched Mercer Group use reasonable-looking arguments built on incomplete information for 19 years, Gerald. I was not going to let the same mechanism work against me from inside my own family." Gerald was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What's the plan?" "With the property, the aquifer rights. What happens now?" Harriet reached beside her and produced a folder she had not yet placed on the table. She had prepared it in the 3 days since Raymond's office in the organized, deliberate way of a woman whose plan had been forming for 2 decades and needed only to be transferred from her head to paper. She walked him through it. The water rights assessment process, the sequence of legal steps required to formalize the aquifer rights under her ownership. The consultation she had already scheduled with a natural resource attorney for the following week. The 2 options she was considering with their respective implications, licensing the rights to a regulated water management company under a long-term conservation agreement or pursuing public trust designation that would protect the water resource permanently and remove it from commercial development entirely. Gerald read the folder page by page. He looked up. "You had this ready." "I've had 20 years to think about what I would do if Vincent was right." She looked at him. He was right. Gerald looked at the folder in his hands. At his mother at the kitchen table in her surveying boots, the documents laid out in front of her, in the order of a presentation she had been preparing in some form since 2004. He set the folder down. He reached into his pocket and took out his phone. He called Susan. He put it on speaker and set the phone on the table between them. Susan answered on the second ring from Denver. Gerald said, "I'm at Mom's. She's here with me. I need to walk you through something." He walked her through it, the geological survey, the suppression Vincent's private assessment, the will condition, the estate transfer, the updated figure. He told it in sequence in the careful language of an accountant who has just revised his understanding of a situation and wants to be precise about the revision. Susan was quiet for the duration. Harriet sat beside her son and listened to him explain her correctly and did not add anything. When Gerald finished, Susan was silent for a long moment. "Then, Mom, are you there?" Harriet said, "I'm here. I owe you an apology. You were worried about me. That's not an apology situation. It is when I brought a presentation." Harriet paused. "Keep it. You may need it someday for something where you're actually right." There was a silence, and then Susan laughed. Briefly, helplessly, the laugh of a woman who had flown from Denver with 12 slides and returned with a question she couldn't answer, and now had the answer, and the answer was her mother on a porch in 2004 drinking tea with an engineer who understood water. Gerald looked at his mother across the kitchen table. He was smiling, the small, private smile of a man recalibrating, revising the story he had told himself about who he was dealing with, making it the correct size. The presentation was still on Susan's phone. She deleted it that afternoon. The knock came at 11 on Tuesday morning while Harriet was in the upstairs hallway with a clipboard, noting the condition of the plaster wall beside the window hairline crack, along the lath joint, cosmetic, not structural, the kind of thing that looks alarming and means nothing. She had been working through the house systematically since 8, the way she had worked through every site in her career, room by room, top to bottom, clipboard in hand, nothing assumed, everything documented. She went downstairs and opened the front door. Nora Pfeiffer stood on the porch with a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil. 69 years old, neighbor of 23 years. The woman who had referred to the Calloway house as a neighborhood liability at 4 separate block association meetings that Harriet had attended and said nothing at. She was wearing her good coat. She looked at Harriet with the expression of someone who has rehearsed an opening and is no longer confident in it. She said, "I brought a chicken casserole. I didn't know what else to bring." Harriet said, "Come in." The kitchen was the only room she had cleaned fully. It was her base of operations, the room where the clipboard lived between floors, where she ate lunch, where the documents from Raymond's office were organized in a folder on the counter. She had set up a folding table and 2 chairs. She put the casserole on the table and found plates, and they sat down, and Nora looked around the kitchen with the expression of someone encountering a space they have driven past and imagined from the outside for a long time and are now discovering is different than they constructed it. "Harriet," Nora set down her fork, "everyone on the street thinks you've lost your mind." "I know. Mrs. Kowalski at number 7 said Gerald told her you used your entire pension." Gerald shouldn't have said that, but yes. Nora looked at her the direct look of a woman who has decided to set aside the social negotiation and ask the thing she actually came to ask. "Are you all right? Honestly?" Harriet said, "Honestly, I've never been more certain of anything in my adult life." Nora set down her fork. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why this house? Of all the things you could have done with that money, why this one? Why now? Why everything you had?" Harriet looked at her neighbor across the folding table. 23 years of proximity block association meetings, borrowed tools, the particular familiarity of people who have lived near each other long enough to have opinions about each other's decisions without ever fully understanding each other. She thought about how much to say. Nora was not Gerald, who needed data in sequence. She was not Susan, who needed the logic reconstructed. She was a neighbor who had been wrong about this house for 19 years, in a different way, not from insufficient information, but from insufficient curiosity. She had looked at the abandonment and called it obstinacy without asking what the obstinacy was in service of. She deserved a different answer than the others had received. Harriet told her about Vincent. Not the geological details, not yet. She told her about the man. The 30 years of tea on the porch Thursday afternoons when the weather permitted. The way Vincent talked about the land not as property, not as an asset, but as a system. The way an engineer talks about something he has studied and understands from the inside. The Mercer Group letters arriving year after year, each one a little more aggressive than the last. The way Vincent had annotated every one of them in red ink in his precise block handwriting with the calm thoroughness of someone who was not frightened, only determined. He was protecting something Nora, not just his house, something underneath it. Nora said, "The abandoned lot always seemed like stubbornness to me. That's what everyone said." It was stubbornness, Harriet said. Stubbornness in service of something real. Those are different things. Nora looked at the table. She had the expression of a woman doing a quiet private accounting, adding up 19 years of assumptions and arriving at a sum she did not like. "What are you going to do with the house?" she said. "Restore it. Live in it at least part of the year it has good bones." She said it with the authority of someone who had spent the morning confirming exactly that with a clipboard. The structural elements are sound. The deferred maintenance is cosmetic mostly. The plaster needs attention. The roof needs a section. Replace the kitchen will need to be rebuilt. She looked around the room. It's a good kitchen space, good light. And the land. The land will need careful management. There's a resource beneath it that needs the right kind of stewardship. "Nora, what kind of resource?" Harriet said water. She said it simply, without elaboration. It was enough for now. She was not withholding to be difficult. She was measuring what Nora was actually asking for, whether she wanted the surface answer or whether she was willing to sit with uncertainty long enough to earn the full one. Nora was quiet for a long moment. She looked out the kitchen window at the overgrown garden, the shape of beds that had once been tended, the old apple tree at the back, that had continued producing despite 19 years without attention, the particular resilience of things left to their own resources. "I called this house an eyesore for 19 years, she said. "It was an eyesore," Harriet said. "I called Vincent obstinate. He was obstinate. I never once asked why." She said it simply without drama, the way people say things when they have moved past the defense of themselves into the plain fact of what they did. "I drove past this house every day for 19 years, and I had an opinion about it, and I never once knocked on his door and asked him what he was holding on to." She looked at Harriet. "I didn't ask you either when you bought it. I called Gerald." "I know. I should have asked you." Harriet looked at her neighbor, the good coat, the casserole dish on the table, the expression of a woman who has decided that being wrong is less comfortable than being corrected, and has come to be corrected. "You're asking now?" Harriet said. "Is it too late?" Harriet helped herself to more casserole. "Nora, I've been patient for 19 years. A few weeks of questions from the neighborhood is nothing." She set the spoon down. "Come back next Tuesday. I'll have more of the house in order. I'll show you what Vincent left." Nora came back the following Tuesday and the Tuesday after that, and eventually most Tuesdays for the remainder of the year. She had been wrong about the house and wrong about Vincent and wrong about Harriet, and she had the particular grace of a woman who, once corrected, wanted to understand everything she had missed. Harriet, who had spent 19 years with a secret and nobody to tell it to, found that having Nora as a witness was unexpectedly useful. Some things are better understood with company. We're almost at the end of this story. If it's moved you, if it feels like something you've lived through, subscribe. Stories like Harriet's deserve to be heard. Gerald arrived at 9 on Saturday morning in work clothes and carrying a pair of gloves he had bought specifically for the occasion, the stiff new kind that would need to be broken, in which Harriet noticed but did not comment on. He had called earlier in the week and asked if he could help with the structural assessment. She had said yes. He had driven 40 minutes and arrived on time. These were the forms of apology available to him, and he was using all of them. They worked through the morning in the way that people who understand each other can work without narrating it, without filling the silence, Harriet moving through the rooms with her clipboard, and Gerald following instructions when they were given and staying out of the way when they were not. She showed him how to check floor joists for deflection, and he did it carefully, methodically, with the concentration of someone who does not know how to do something, but intends to do it correctly. He got the hang of it by the third room. At noon, Harriet made sandwiches and they took them to the back porch. The porch looked onto the garden overgrown, the beds indistinct under the February growth, the old apple tree at the back still standing with the particular stubbornness of old trees, its bare branches holding their shape against the gray sky. The porch boards were solid. Vincent had built things to last. Gerald ate his sandwich and looked at the garden for a while. Then, "I've been thinking about what you said, about waiting until you could prove it before telling us." "Yes?" "You didn't trust us to believe you without proof." Harriet said, "I didn't trust the situation to survive an argument without proof. Those are different things." Gerald considered this. "Are they?" "Yes." She set down her sandwich. "I trust you, Gerald. I trusted that you would argue with me not because you're unreasonable, but because you're an accountant and the numbers looked wrong, and you would have been doing your job as my son by arguing. If I had told you about the aquifer before I had the documents in hand, you would have spent 2 weeks being patient with me while simultaneously convincing me that I was misremembering a conversation from 2004. She looked at him, which you would have done with complete sincerity and very good intentions. Gerald said, "I would have." "I know." A pause. "Your father used to do the same thing," Harriet said. "He wanted documentation before belief. It wasn't doubt exactly, it was the way his mind was built. He needed the paper before he could let himself trust the conclusion." She looked at the garden. "I managed around that for 40 years. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You managed him the same way you managed us. When the situation required it, yes." He absorbed this with the expression of a man discovering that a room he thought he knew had a wall that was actually a door, and that his mother had been using it for longer than he had been alive. They finished their sandwiches. The garden was still in the cold air. Somewhere in the apple tree a bird was working at something in the bark. Gerald said, "Mom, the folder you showed me. The plan for the aquifer rights." "Yes, the 2 options, licensing to a water management company or public trust designation." He had set his plate aside and was looking at the garden with the focused attention of someone who has been doing research. "I've been looking into both of them since last week. The licensing option is cleaner, financially immediate income stream, less legal complexity in the short term." He paused. "But the public trust designation, I think it's the right one." Harriet looked at him. "A designated public water trust removes the aquifer from commercial development permanently," he said. "It means you can't sell the rights, you can't license them in a way that depletes the resource, you can't do what Mercer Group wanted to do, extract the value and move on. The water stays where it is. It stays viable." He looked at her. Vincent didn't want the water developed. He wanted it protected. The trust designation is the version of this where you protect it the same way he protected it, just with a legal instrument instead of a locked cabinet. Harriet was quiet. Gerald reached into the bag he had left by the porch door and produced a folder thinner than the one Harriet had shown him, but organized in the same way tabs along the edge documents in sequence. He held it out. She took it. She opened it. Inside a summary of the public trust designation process in the state, the relevant statutes, a comparison of 3 existing aquifer trust designations in neighboring counties with their administrative structures, and a 1-page analysis in Gerald's handwriting comparing the long-term financial and legal implications of both options, the licensing arrangement and the trust. At the bottom of the analysis in the margin he had written, Vincent's logic was correct. The question is whether we execute it the same way he would have wanted. Harriet read the folder the way she read everything fully without skimming, giving each page the attention it had been prepared to receive. When she finished, she looked at her son. "You did this on your own." I had time this week. He looked at the garden. I've been thinking about Vincent, about what you said he was protecting. He paused. I never knew him. He was just the man in the house at the end of the street that everyone said wouldn't sell. I had an opinion about him without knowing anything about him. He was quiet for a moment. That seemed like something I should correct. Harriet folded the folder closed and held it in her lap. The public trust designation will take longer, she said. More legal process, more documentation, more time before anything is formally settled. Yes, you understand that. You waited 19 years, Mom. I think we can wait another 18 months for the paperwork. Harriet looked at her son on the back porch of Vincent Calloway's house, the work gloves on the railing beside him, the folder he had prepared on his own initiative, the garden stretching out behind him in its February state waiting for spring, the way things wait when they understand that waiting is not the same as ending. She said, Your father would have liked this porch. Gerald looked at it. Good bones. Yes, Harriet said, good bones. 3 months later, Mercer Group withdrew its final offer. They did it quietly. No public statement, no revised proposal, no polite letter expressing regret. Just a short legal notice sent to Harriet's attorney confirming that the company was no longer pursuing acquisition of the Calloway property or any associated subsurface rights. The sentence was brief. The meaning was not. For nearly 20 years, Vincent Calloway had been dismissed as stubborn, eccentric, unreasonable an old man refusing to sell a decaying house that everyone else believed had no value. Then Harriet had spent her pension on that same abandoned house, and her own children had called it desperation, confusion, even pride. But now a corporate development firm worth hundreds of millions of dollars had stepped away from it. Not because the land was worthless, because Harriet had found what made it priceless. The aquifer documentation, the sealed correspondence, the geological surveys, Vincent's handwritten notes, and Gerald's public trust research had moved from Harriet's kitchen table to an attorney's office, then to the county water board, then to a state environmental review committee. For the first time since Vincent had locked those papers away, the truth was no longer sitting in a cabinet. It was entering the record. Harriet did not attend the first public hearing with any dramatic speech prepared. She wore a navy coat she had owned for 15 years, sensible shoes, and the small pearl earrings Gerald had given her on her 60th birthday. She carried one folder, not the large one, not the original documents. Just one folder containing the statement she had written by hand, then typed carefully on Vincent's old desk. Gerald drove her. Marcy came too. That surprised Harriet more than she admitted. Her daughter had called 2 days before the hearing and asked carefully whether Harriet wanted company. Harriet had said yes before Marcy could make the question smaller or easier to retract. Now Marcy sat beside her in the county meeting room holding a paper cup of coffee she had not touched. The room was not grand. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, folding chairs, a long table at the front where committee members adjusted microphones and shuffled packets of printed reports. But to Harriet it felt strangely important, not because the room was impressive, because the truth had finally been invited inside. When her name was called, Gerald stood as if to help her. Harriet touched his arm. I have it, she said. And she did. She walked to the microphone with the steady pace of a woman who had been underestimated long enough to become familiar with the sound of people realizing they were wrong. She placed her folder on the table, opened it, took one breath. Then she began. My name is Harriet Ellison. 3 months ago, I purchased the Calloway house on County Road, 12 with my entire pension withdrawal. At the time, my family and my neighbors believed I had made a foolish decision. A few people shifted in their seats. Harriet continued. I understand why they thought that. The house was in poor condition, the land was neglected, the property had been on nobody's list of sensible investments for a very long time. She looked down at the page, then back up. But Vincent Calloway did not preserve that house because he misunderstood its value. He preserved it because he understood its value better than anyone else. No one moved now. Harriet explained the aquifer beneath the property. She explained the old survey. She explained the purchase offers Vincent had rejected. She explained without bitterness how easily land can be dismissed when its worth is not visible from the road. Then she closed the folder. For a moment she did not read. She spoke plainly. Vincent protected this place by refusing to sell it. I am asking this board to help protect it in a way that does not depend on one old man saying no or one old woman being stubborn enough to believe him. Behind her, Gerald lowered his eyes. Marcy pressed her fingers to her mouth. Harriet's voice remained calm. This water should not belong to a company. It should not belong to a family argument. It should not belong to whoever can wait long enough for the next elderly person to become tired, frightened, or broke. She paused. It should belong to the future. The room was silent, not shocked, listening, and Harriet understood then that there is a particular kind of justice that does not arrive loudly. It does not humiliate anyone. It does not require applause. It simply places the truth where people can no longer step around it. The board did not vote that day. Government, Harriet had learned, moved more slowly than grief, and only slightly faster than old houses settling in cold weather. But 6 weeks later, the preliminary designation was approved. The Callaway Aquifer Conservation Trust was created. The house and surrounding acreage would remain privately held during Harriet's lifetime, but the subsurface water rights were permanently restricted from commercial extraction. After Harriet's death, the land would transfer into a protected local trust, with Gerald and Marcy named as the first family representatives on the advisory board. Harriet insisted on that. Gerald had tried to refuse. Marcy had cried. Harriet had simply said, "You both need to learn how to inherit something that is not money." That ended the discussion. By late spring, the Callaway house no longer looked abandoned. Not restored, not yet, but awake. The broken porch rail had been repaired. The front steps had been reinforced. The kitchen windows opened again. The old parlor had been cleared of debris, and sunlight reached the floorboards for the first time in years. Harriet kept Vincent's cabinet. She did not move it. She cleaned it, oiled the hinges, and placed the original documents inside acid-free sleeves. Gerald arranged for proper archival storage copies, but Harriet wanted the cabinet to remain where Vincent had left it. Some things she believed should not be modernized out of meaning. One Saturday in May, the family gathered at the house for the first time without an argument waiting in the walls. Gerald brought tools. Marcy brought curtains. The grandchildren brought noise which Harriet had not realized the house needed until it was there. They ran through the hallway, asked too many questions, opened doors they had been told not to open, and discovered the old apple tree in the back garden as though no child in history had ever discovered a tree before. Harriet watched from the porch. A year earlier, she had been sitting alone at her kitchen table, looking at pension numbers and listening to her children explain what she could not afford. Now Gerald was teaching his son how to measure a board twice before cutting it once. Marcy was kneeling in the garden pulling weeds from around the stone border. And Harriet was holding a cup of tea on a porch built by a man everyone had misjudged. Gerald came up the steps and stood beside her. "You know," he said, looking at the garden, the trust paperwork came back with the final recorded name. Harriet turned to him. He handed her the copy. At the top of the page in official county formatting were the words, "The Vincent Callaway Water Trust." Harriet read it once. Then again, her eyes moved slowly across the name. "Gerald said Marcy and I talked to the attorney. We thought, if that's all right with you." Harriet did not answer immediately. She looked out toward the garden, toward the apple tree, toward the land Vincent had refused to surrender, and she had refused to misunderstand. For 19 years, a man had guarded the truth alone. For 3 months, Harriet had carried it forward while people who loved her doubted her. Now his name was not a rumor at the edge of town. It was on the record. She folded the paper carefully. "Yes," she said. "That's right." Gerald nodded. After a moment, he said, "Mom." "Yes. I'm sorry we made you prove yourself before we believed you." Harriet looked at her son. There were many answers she could have given. She could have said that he should be sorry. She could have said that belief should not have required documents, folders, surveys, attorneys, and hearings. She could have reminded him of every word that had hurt her. But Harriet had not spent her pension to win an argument. She had spent it because truth sometimes comes hidden inside things everyone else has stopped seeing. So she said, "Then remember it next time." Gerald's face changed. Not wounded. Taut. "I will," he said. And Harriet believed him. That evening, after everyone left, Harriet stayed behind. The house was quiet again, but not empty. That was different. There were muddy footprints near the back door, a forgotten child's sweater on the banister, a stack of folded curtains on the parlor chair, Gerald's pencil marks on a piece of trim, Marcy's gardening gloves beside the kitchen sink. Signs of life. Signs of return. Harriet walked through the rooms, slowly. In the parlor, the late light fell across the floorboards in long amber strips. Dust moved through the air, visible only because the sun had chosen to reveal it. She stopped at Vincent's cabinet. For a long time, she stood there with her hand resting on the top. Then she opened the drawer. Inside were the documents that had changed everything. The survey, the letter from the hydrologist, the rejected offer, Vincent's handwritten notes, the proof. Harriet placed one more item inside, a copy of the trust designation. On top of it, she set a small note written in her own hand. "You were right to wait. I was right to listen." She closed the drawer. The latch clicked softly. Outside, the old apple tree moved in the evening wind. Harriet stepped onto the porch and looked at the land. She had not become rich, not in the way her children had once feared or hoped. There was no sudden fortune, no check large enough to make everyone forget what they had said when they thought she was foolish. Mercer Group did not pay her millions. The house did not become a luxury development. The aquifer did not become an asset on somebody's quarterly report. Instead, something quieter happened. The land remained whole. The water remained protected. Vincent's name remained attached to the thing he had saved. And Harriet's children finally understood that independence was not loneliness, and age was not evidence of decline, and a mother's silence did not mean she had no plan. The next morning, Harriet woke early in the small bedroom she had chosen for herself at the back of the house. The room still smelled faintly of old wood and lemon oil. The walls needed paint. The window stuck halfway when she tried to open it. Somewhere under the floor, a pipe knocked once and went still. Harriet smiled. A house with problems was still a house with a future. She made coffee in the kitchen and carried it to the porch. The garden was silver with morning dew. The apple tree stood at the back, no longer bare. Tiny green leaves had begun to open along the branches. Spring had arrived without asking permission. Harriet sat down. For the first time in many months, she did not calculate what she had left. She did not count pension dollars. She did not measure loss. She did not rehearse explanations for people determined not to understand her. She simply sat on the porch of the house she had chosen. The house everyone called abandoned. The house her children thought would ruin her. The house Vincent had protected. The house that had held behind a locked cabinet and years of dust. The proof that Harriet had not been reckless. She had been right. And in the quiet morning light, with the protected land stretching before her and the old floorboards steady beneath her feet, Harriet finally understood something Vincent must have known all along. Some houses are not empty. They are waiting for the one person brave enough to see what everyone else missed.